The Great Hall of Harmonium Prime had never been so quiet. The orbital station floated in the darkness between stars, far from any sun, built in neutral space so that no species could claim advantage over another. For 10,000 years, the Galactic Council had met here to solve problems, settle disputes, and guide civilization forward. But today, there were no solutions to offer. Today, there was only fear. Ambassador Oran stood at the center of the chamber, his crystalline body catching the dim light and scattering it into rainbows across the walls. He was old, even by standards. He had seen empires rise and fall. He had watched stars die, but he had never felt despair like this. "The hollow tide has consumed the periphery systems," he announced, his voice like wind through glass. 17 inhabited worlds, 4 billion lives, gone. The holographic display behind him showed the damage. A massive swarm of machines, each one no bigger than a grain of sand, moving through space like a dark cloud. They ate everything in their path: planets, moons, asteroids, ships. They broke matter down to its basic parts and used those parts to make more of themselves. No one knew where they came from. No one knew how to stop them. Counselor Prime drifted in his containment sphere, his gaseous body swirling with dark colors that showed his distress. His species had lived in the hearts of gas giants for millions of years. They had seen much. They had survived much. But this was different. "Our weapons do nothing," he rumbled. "We destroy 1 million of the machines, and they rebuild 10 million more. We cannot fight an enemy that grows stronger from our attacks." The delegation sat perfectly still, their bodies arranged in mathematical patterns that helped them think. They had spent 300 years calculating solutions. Every simulation ended the same way. "We have run every possible scenario," their speaker announced in flat, emotionless tones. "There is no strategy that results in victory. The hollow tide will reach the galactic core in 18 cycles. At that point, all organized civilization will end." Silence fell over the chamber. 12 species, some of them older than the stars themselves, sat with the weight of extinction pressing down on them. The architects of who had built wonders that understanding had no answer. The mind collective of who existed as pure thought could find no solution. The warriors of who had never lost a battle in 50,000 years had nothing left to fight with. "Then we must authorize the Exodus Protocol," Ambassador Oran said. The words felt like knives in his throat. "We will build, we will save what populations we can. We will flee to the void between galaxies and hope the hollow tide does not follow." "We will save perhaps 1% of our people," Counselor Prime said. "The rest will die. 1% is better than none." No one argued. There was nothing to argue about. The mathematics were clear. The future was written. They would run, and most of them would die, and their great civilization would become refugees in the empty dark. Then a door opened at the far end of the chamber. The human delegation walked in. There were only 3 of them, small and fragile-looking compared to the ancient beings around them. Humans had been spacefaring for barely 300 years. They were children in a room full of elders. Their representative, a woman named Maria, had dark hair going at the temples and lines around her eyes that spoke of too little sleep and too much worry. She walked like someone who had been running for a long time and had finally decided to stop. "Apologies for being late," she said. "We were reviewing your data." Ambassador Oran felt something close to pity. The humans meant well, but they simply did not understand the scale of what they faced. His species had been building starships when humans still lived in caves. "Ambassador," he said gently, "we appreciate your presence, but this matter is beyond human capability. We have tried everything. The greatest minds in the galaxy have worked on this problem for centuries. There is no solution." Maria nodded. She looked at the holographic display, at the dark swarm eating its way toward the heart of everything. She was quiet for 47 seconds. The council waited, expecting her to ask questions, to request explanations, to slowly grasp the horror of what she was seeing. Instead, she smiled. "We've got this," she said. The translation systems hummed with confusion. Several counselors requested clarification. The phrase did not convert properly into their languages. They clicked their mandibles in what might have been irritation. "Got what?" Counselor Prime asked. "What do you have?" "This situation," Maria said. "We'll handle it." Ambassador Oran's crystalline form flickered with colors that indicated disbelief. "Ambassador, with respect, you cannot simply handle an existential threat to all galactic civilization. Your species has never faced anything of this magnitude. You do not have the technology, the experience, or the resources." "Probably not," Maria agreed, "but we'll figure it out." "Figure it out?" The speaker's voice rose with something almost like emotion. "We have spent 300 years figuring it out. We have used computational systems that can model every atom in a star. We have consulted species whose understanding of physics makes yours look like children playing with blocks. There is nothing to figure out. It cannot be done." Maria looked at the alien, really looked, and the council saw something in her eyes that they did not recognize. It was not hope exactly. It was not confidence. It was something stranger, something that their ancient languages had no word for. "Every problem has a solution," she said. "Sometimes you just have to be too stubborn to accept that it doesn't." She nodded politely to the council, thanked them for their time, and walked out of the chamber. Her two companions followed without a word. The door closed behind them. For a long moment, no one spoke. "They are going to die," Counselor Prime finally said. "They are going to try something foolish, and they are going to die, and it will change nothing." Ambassador Oran watched the door where the humans had disappeared. He had lived for 12,000 years. He had seen countless species rise and fall. He knew the look of denial, of desperate hope in the face of certain doom. But something about Maria's smile bothered him. It was not the smile of someone who refused to accept reality. It was the smile of someone who had seen reality and decided to change it anyway. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "but I find myself curious to see what they attempt." The council returned to planning the Exodus protocol. But in the back of every mind, a small question had taken root. What if the humans actually tried? What if they actually believed they could win? And what would happen when they discovered they were wrong? 2 cycles passed. The hollow tide continued its march toward the galactic core, eating everything in its path. The council continued planning the Exodus, calculating how many ships they could build, how many people they could save, how many billions would be left behind to die. Then the humans requested another meeting. The council gathered with weary resignation. They expected tears, perhaps, begging for help, a desperate plea for seats on the. That was what young species did when they finally understood their own mortality. The elders would be kind. They would offer what comfort they could. Instead, Dr. James walked into the chamber carrying a data tablet and a cup of something that smelled like burnt beans. "Good morning," he said cheerfully, "or good evening, or whatever time it is here. Space is confusing." He was a large man with dark skin and in his beard. He wore a wrinkled coat with stains on the sleeves and had the look of someone who had not slept in days. Behind him came Ambassador and a young woman with bright eyes and burn marks on her hands. "We have a plan," Doctor announced. "We're calling it Operation Boomerang." He uploaded his data to the council's display systems. Diagrams appeared in the air, showing calculations, ship movements, and something that made the delegation freeze in their seats. "The basic idea is simple," Doctor continued. "The hollow tide follows gravity. It goes where the mass is. So we're going to give it some mass to follow. Specifically, we're going to collapse the dying star in the system into an artificial black hole. The gravitational pull will curve the swarm's path, bending it away from the galactic core and into a prepared kill zone." Counselor Prime leaned forward in his containment sphere. And what happens in this kill zone? Ah, Doctor smiled. That's where it gets interesting. We've identified 17 rogue singularities drifting in deep space. Small black holes, basically. We're going to capture them, position them in a precise pattern, and detonate them simultaneously. The chamber went completely silent. Detonate, Ambassador Iran repeated slowly. You want to detonate black holes. Just 17 of them. It'll create a localized reality fracture. Basically, we'll punch a hole in the universe itself. The hollow tide gets sucked through into another dimension, the hole closes behind them, and our galaxy is saved. The speaker made a sound like breaking glass. You want to break spacetime, on purpose. Just a little, Doctor said. We've done the math. No, they rose from their seats, their bodies shaking with emotion their species rarely showed. No, you have not done the math, because the math says this is impossible. No species has ever successfully manipulated singularities. The gravitational forces alone would tear any ship apart before it got close enough to attempt capture. We've designed new ships. The energy required to collapse a star into a black hole, artificially, would require more power than your entire civilization produces in a century. We've found a way around that. And the reality fracture, the speaker's voice rose to something almost like a scream. Do you know what happens when you break spacetime? The last civilization that attempted reality manipulation no longer exists, not destroyed, does not exist. They were erased from every timeline. There was never born. Their species never evolved. That is what happens when you play with reality. Doctor nodded thoughtfully. Yes, we read about that. Fascinating case study. We think we know where they went wrong. The young woman behind him, the one with burned hands, stepped forward. Her name was, and she looked barely old enough to have finished school. The civilization used a single-point fracture, she said. All the stress concentrated in one location. That's what caused the cascade failure. Our design uses a distributed network. 17 points of failure instead of one. The stress gets spread out. Manageable. Manageable. Ambassador Iran's crystalline body flickered with patterns that indicated disbelief. You are talking about tearing a hole in the fabric of existence, and you call it manageable. Everything is manageable if you break it down into small enough steps, said. That's engineering. Counselor Prime's gaseous form had turned almost black with distress. What are your odds of success? What do your own calculations tell you? Doctor checked his tablet. About 0.003%, give or take. 0.003%. The speaker sank back into their seat. You have come here to propose a plan with a 99.997% chance of failure. When you put it that way, it sounds bad, Doctor admitted. But look at it from our perspective. The alternative is 100% extinction. 0.003 is better odds than that. The alternative is survival through exodus. We can save 1% of our populations. That is better than your impossible gamble. Ambassador, who had been quiet until now, stepped forward. With respect, Counselor, 1% is not survival. It is a slow death. Your species, your cultures, your histories, they cannot fit in. You would save bodies but lose everything that makes those bodies matter. She looked around the chamber at beings older than humanity's oldest dreams. Giants of the galaxy, masters of sciences that humans barely understood, and she spoke to them like equals. We know our plan sounds insane, she said. We know the odds are against us, but humans have always been bad at accepting odds. We built civilizations in deserts. We crossed oceans in wooden boats. We went to our moon in ships held together with bolts and prayers. Every step forward in our history came from someone looking at impossible odds and saying, let's try anyway. And many of those attempts ended in death, Ambassador Iran pointed out. Yes, but enough succeeded, and that's all we need. One success. One moment where the impossible becomes possible, that's worth trying for. The council deliberated for 6 hours. The arguments went in circles. They insisted the plan was mathematical suicide. The worried about the consequences of failure. The older species remembered every civilization that had reached too far and fallen. But in the end, they agreed to let the humans try. Not because they believed it would work. Not because they had hope. They agreed because something about the human certainty made them curious. Because watching the attempt, even a doomed one, seemed more interesting than sitting in the dark waiting to die. Because after 10,000 years of cautious wisdom, the council found itself wondering what it would feel like to be young and stupid and brave again. "We will observe," Ambassador Oran announced. "We will not help, but we will not interfere. Show us this impossible thing you believe you can do." Doctor finished his burnt-smelling drink and grinned. "Excellent, we're going to need some volunteers. Anyone here know how to pilot a ship directly into a black hole?" The chamber fell silent again. "Don't worry," said, "we'll figure that part out too." The news spread across the galaxy like fire through dry grass. The humans were going to attempt the impossible. The humans were going to fight the hollow tide. The humans were going to break reality itself to save everyone. Most species laughed. Some shook their heads in pity. A few made bets on how quickly the humans would die. But then something strange began to happen. Ships started arriving at the staging point. Not warships, not military vessels sent to help. Observer ships, science vessels, private craft belonging to researchers who had spent centuries in quiet laboratories and suddenly felt the need to see something happen. They came from every corner of the galaxy, drawn by curiosity, by disbelief, by a desire to witness the last great folly of a young species. They came to watch humanity fail. Seven was one of them. She was young by standards, only 800 years old, and she had spent most of those years studying engineering theories that her people had abandoned as impossible long ago. Her elders called her foolish. They said she wasted her time on dead ends. But something about the human plan had caught her attention, and she had requested permission to observe them at work. Her first day among the humans was confusing. She had expected desperation. She had expected fear, panic, the frantic energy of creatures facing death. Instead, she found something else entirely. The humans were singing. They sang while they worked on their ships. They sang while they ran calculations that made mathematicians weep. They sang songs about love, about loss, about home, about hope. Songs that made no sense and followed no logical pattern. Songs that seemed to exist purely because the humans enjoyed making noise together. "Why do you do that?" Seven asked a human engineer named. He was covered in grease and had not slept in what appeared to be days. "Do what?" "Sing. You are preparing for an operation with a 0.003% chance of success. You will most likely die. Why do you sing?" Thought about this for a moment. "Because it makes the work go faster. Because my grandmother used to sing this song when I was small. Because if I'm going to die, I'd rather die with a song in my heart than silence." He shrugged. "Also, it annoys the observers, and that's always fun." Seven did not understand. She filed the observation away for later analysis and continued watching. The humans worked without rest. They modified ships using techniques that Seven had only read about in ancient texts. They built devices that her people had declared impossible 4,000 years ago. And when those devices did not work, they did something that shocked her more than anything else. They tried again. She watched a team attempt to calibrate a gravitational lens. The first attempt failed. The second failed worse. The third attempt actually exploded, destroying 3 months of work in seconds. The human team lead, a woman named Dr. Sarah Park, stood in the wreckage with burns on her face and tears in her eyes. "Well," she said after a long moment, "that didn't work." "No," Seven agreed. "Perhaps you should accept that this approach is not viable. My people abandoned this technology because. Let's try it with a modified resonance pattern. What? Dr. Park was already pulling components from the debris, sorting through the destruction for salvageable parts. The explosion happened when the harmonics hit feedback. If we shift the resonance by 0.37 degrees, we might avoid the cascade. That is not how physics works. Physics is a suggestion. Dr. Park grinned, and there was something wild in her eyes. We're making polite requests. They tried again, and again, and again. 14 failures. 14 times 7 watched the humans build something, watch it fail, and immediately start rebuilding. On the 15th attempt, it worked. The gravitational lens powered up smoothly. The readings matched the theoretical predictions. The device that had declared impossible 4,000 years ago hummed quietly in its housing, doing exactly what the humans had designed it to do. Seven stared at it for a long time. How? She finally asked. My people tried this for centuries. We had better resources, better technology, more time. How did you succeed where we failed? Dr. Park wiped soot from her face and considered the question. Your people gave up. We didn't. But the mathematics clearly showed. The mathematics showed it was unlikely, not impossible. There's a difference. Dr. Park put her hand on the device, feeling it vibrate with contained power. Your people looked at the odds and decided they were too long. We looked at the same odds and decided they were worth trying anyway. That is irrational. Probably, but here's the thing about being irrational. Dr. Park smiled, and Seven saw something in that smile that she had never seen before. Not hope, not confidence, something stronger than both. Sometimes irrational is the only way forward. Sometimes the universe tells you something can't be done, and you have to be crazy enough to try anyway, because the universe is wrong more often than it thinks. Seven thought about this for a long time. She thought about her people, ancient and wise, who had learned to accept limits. She thought about the humans, young and foolish, who refused to accept anything. And she made a decision that would change her life forever. I want to help, she said. I have studied your impossible engineering for 8 centuries. I know the theories your people have not had time to learn. I can contribute. Dr. Park's eyes widened. You want to join us, you know the odds. I know the odds. I no longer care about the odds. Seven felt something shifting inside her, something she had not felt in centuries. Excitement, possibility, the thrill of reaching for something you might not grasp. I want to see what happens when you refuse to give up. I want to be part of it. Word spread through the observer fleet. The young had joined the humans. Others followed. A scientist who had spent 300 years studying singularities offered his expertise. A mathematician, unable to sleep since seeing the human calculations, quietly transferred to a human ship to help refine the numbers. Even one of the ancient architects of creatures who had not communicated with other species in 10,000 years sent a message. We are interested. We will observe more closely. The observers had come to watch humanity fail. Instead, they found themselves wanting humanity to succeed. Because watching the humans work was not like watching a disaster unfold. It was like watching something be born, something new, something that had never existed before, a kind of determination that the old species had forgotten they could feel. On the human flagship, Admiral Sophia looked out at the gathering fleet. Ships from 20 species now orbited alongside her vessels. Scientists and engineers from civilizations older than Earth itself worked alongside human crews, all of them united by something simple and impossible and utterly human. They came to watch us fail, her aide observed. Yes, Admiral agreed, but I think they're starting to hope we won't. She turned back to her command console, where the final preparations were being completed. In 3 days, they would begin the operation. In 3 days, they would try to do something that had never been done before. In 3 days, they would find out if stubbornness could save a galaxy. All hands, she announced over the fleet-wide channel. Let's show them what impossible looks like. The hollow tide entered the system like a shadow eating the stars. Trillions upon trillions of machines, each one smaller than a grain of sand, moving together as one hungry darkness. They had consumed 17 star systems already. They would consume everything if no one stopped them. The human fleet waited at the edge of the system. 47,000 volunteers crewed 300 ships, each one modified with technology that should not exist. Behind them, at a safe distance, the observer fleet watched. The greatest minds of a dozen species held their breath. Admiral Sophia stood on the bridge of the flagship unconquered, her hands steady on the command console. The dying star filled her, bloated and red, ready for the transformation that would save the galaxy or kill everyone trying. "Begin Operation Boomerang," she ordered. The first phase went perfectly. Human ships dove toward the dying star, deploying gravitational pumps that her species had invented 3 weeks ago. The star groaned, its surface rippling as artificial forces pulled at its core. Matter compressed. Density increased. The light turned from red to orange to white to a color that had no name. The star collapsed into a black hole. Singularity formed, Doctor reported from the science vessel Newton. Gravitational pull is exactly as predicted. The hollow tide is changing course. On the dark swarm curved. The new black hole's gravity reached out like a hand and grabbed them, pulling them away from the galactic core, bending their path toward the prepared kill zone. Phase 1 complete. Then everything started going wrong. "Admiral, we have a problem." His voice came from Engineering Bay 7. 3 of the captured singularities are destabilizing. The containment fields are failing. "Can you repair them?" "We're trying, but the gravitational interference is." The connection dissolved into static. Admiral checked her displays. The 17 captured black holes were supposed to be positioned in a precise pattern, a net of gravitational forces that would tear reality apart when activated. But 3 of them were drifting, their positions changing, their containment weakening. "All ships adjust formation. We need to compensate for the drift." The fleet moved. Thousands of humans worked in perfect coordination, each one knowing that a single mistake could kill them all. They adjusted course, recalculated trajectories, fought to keep the impossible plan on track. Then the hollow tide reached the leading edge of the formation. The dreadnought Prometheus was the first to fall. The swarm hit it like a wave, machines swarming over the hull, eating through metal and flesh and everything between. The ship had 3,000 crew. They had 7 seconds of warning. Captain used those 7 seconds to transmit every piece of data her sensors had gathered. Information about the swarm's movement patterns, density distribution, weak points. Data that might help the ships behind her survive. Her last words were coordinates. Admiral watched the Prometheus disappear, consumed by darkness. She did not allow herself to feel it. Not yet. There would be time for grief later if there was a later. "The swarm is accelerating," the observer reported, her voice shaking. "Your timeline calculations are off. The hollow tide will reach the kill zone 16 minutes ahead of schedule." "Then we go faster." Admiral opened a fleet-wide channel. "All hands, we are ahead of schedule. Adjust all operations accordingly. We do not have time to do this right. We will do it anyway." The scientist who had joined them spoke up from his position on the sensor array. The reality fracture calculations assumed precise positioning of all 17 singularities. With 3 unstable and the timeline compressed, the mathematics no longer work. Your plan has failed. "Then we make a new plan." Admiral turned to her tactical officer. "Options. We could abort, pull back, try again later with better preparation. The hollow tide reaches the galactic core in 12 days if we don't stop it here. There is no later." "Then I don't have options, I have prayers." Admiral closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. When she opened them, Something had changed. Something old and cold and determined had settled into her bones. "All hands," she announced on every channel. "We're going to Plan G." Counselor Prime, listening from the observer fleet, made a sound of confusion. There was no Plan G in the briefing documents. "That's because we just made it up," Admiral replied. "Stand by." What followed next violated 17 laws of physics. Later, when scientists tried to analyze what happened, their instruments would give readings that contradicted each other. Some would say the humans achieved the impossible. Others would say the impossible simply gave up arguing. The three destabilized singularities needed to be repositioned. There was no way to do this from the outside. The gravitational forces would crush any ship that tried to approach. So the humans flew into the black holes themselves. 3 volunteer crews piloted their ships directly into the event horizons, the point of no return around each singularity. They used the gravity itself, riding the crushing force like a wave, using it to push the black holes into position. It should have killed them instantly. The physics said it was impossible to survive even approaching an event horizon. The humans did not care what physics said. Captain John and his crew of 57 were the first. Their ship, the Perseverance, hit the event horizon at speeds that should have torn it apart. Instead, used the gravitational shear to spin his vessel, creating a counter-rotation that somehow held the ship together. He transmitted positioning data for 37 seconds. Then the black hole took him, and he was gone forever. The second crew vented their atmosphere deliberately, using the escaping air as thrust when their engines failed. They lived long enough to move their target singularity 200 kilometers, enough to save the operation. The third crew's ship broke apart. The captain, a young woman named Lisa, continued transmitting calculations while her body froze in the vacuum of space. Her last words were numbers. On the observer fleet, 7 watched in horror and wonder. Could not cry, but something inside her cracked and reformed in a new shape. "They are dying," she whispered. "They are dying and they are still working." "Yes," said the ancient architect speaking aloud for the first time in 10,000 years. "That is what makes them different. That is what makes them terrifying. That is what makes them beautiful." The kill zone was ready. The singularities were in position. The hollow tide poured into the prepared space like water into a trap. Admiral gave the final order. "Detonate." 17 black holes erupted at once. Reality screamed. Space itself tore open like fabric, revealing something beneath that had no color, no shape, no name. The fracture spread across the kill zone, a wound in existence itself. The hollow tide tried to flee. For the first time since it had begun its march across the galaxy, the swarm tried to escape, but gravity held it. The 17 singularities, positioned by human sacrifice, created a funnel that allowed only one direction of travel. Into the fracture, into the void, into somewhere else. Trillions of machines poured through the wound in reality, falling forever into a dimension that had no end. The swarm that had eaten 17 star systems, that had threatened all galactic civilization, disappeared into darkness. And then the fracture closed. Admiral stood on her bridge, surrounded by silence. The showed empty space where the hollow tide had been. Stars shone quietly, unaware of how close they had come to extinction. "All hands," she said, and her voice cracked with emotion she could no longer contain. "We got them. The hollow tide is gone." Across the fleet, humans began to weep. They wept for joy, for relief, for the friends they had lost. They held each other and screamed and laughed and cried all at once. In the observer fleet, beings who had lived sat in stunned silence. They had come to watch the impossible fail. Instead, they had watched the impossible win. The Galactic Council reconvened 3 days after Operation Boomerang. The Great Hall of Harmonium Prime, which had once held only despair, now buzzed with something the ancient species barely recognized. It took the translators several hours to identify the emotion. Hoping. Of the 47,000 humans who had participated in the operation, only 12,000 survived. The rest had been consumed by the hollow tide, crushed by singularities, lost in the reality fracture, or killed in the thousand other ways that such an impossible mission could kill. Their names filled databases that would be preserved forever, monuments to those who had given everything so that the galaxy could continue. The humans mourned their dead with songs and stories. They wept openly, without shame, holding each other in corridors and meeting halls. They spoke the names of friends who would never come home, described their jokes and their habits and their dreams. They made sure that no one was forgotten. And then, less than an hour after the memorial service ended, they started arguing about how to improve the plan for next time. Ambassador Iran watched the humans from across the chamber. He had lived for 12,000 years. He had seen civilizations rise and fall. He had watched species evolve and species go extinct. But he had never seen anything like this. "Next time," he asked, his crystalline body flickering with confusion, "you speak as if there will be another threat like the hollow tide." Ambassador Maria looked up from the tablet she was studying. She had not slept in 4 days, and grief had carved new lines into her face, but her eyes still held that strange light that Iran had noticed in their first meeting. "There's always a next time," she said. "The universe is full of impossible things. We'll handle them as they come." "How can you say that? You lost 35,000 of your people. Your operation nearly failed multiple times. You succeeded through luck as much as skill." "We succeeded through stubbornness," Maria corrected gently. "Luck just helped. And yes, we lost 35,000. That hurts more than I can express. But the alternative was losing everyone, all of us, every species in the galaxy. 35,000 is a tragedy. Extinction is worse." Counselor Prime drifted forward, his gaseous form showing colors that indicated deep thought. "We have discussed your species extensively since the operation. We have analyzed your behavior, your psychology, your history. We do not understand how you function." "We don't really understand it either," Maria admitted with a tired smile. "We just keep going." "But why?" The speaker leaned forward, mandibles clicking with frustration. "Why do you keep going when mathematics says you should stop? Why do you try things that cannot work? Why do you sacrifice yourselves for odds that any rational being would reject?" Maria was quiet for a moment. She looked around the chamber at beings who had existed when her planet was still molten rock, at species who had mastered sciences her people were only beginning to understand. "Because we don't have time to give up," she said finally. "Humans live about 80 years if we're lucky. That's nothing compared to you. A heartbeat, a candle flame. We don't have centuries to think things over. We don't have to accept limits. By the time we've decided something is impossible, we're already dead." She stood up, and despite her small size, despite her fragility, every ancient being in the chamber paid attention. "So we try anyway. We reach for things we can't have because we might not get another chance. We fight battles we can't win because losing is just another form of dying, and we're going to die anyway. We look at impossible odds and say, let's see what happens, because wondering if we could have one feels worse than losing." "That sounds exhausting," Counselor Prime observed. It absolutely is." Maria laughed, and there was sadness in it, but something else too. Pride, maybe, or love. "But it's also wonderful, because sometimes once in a while, against all odds, we do it. We climb the mountain, we cross the ocean, we reach the moon, we save the galaxy, and those moments make all the failure worth it." Seven, the young who had joined the human crews, stepped forward. She had changed since the operation. Her crystalline matrix held new patterns, new colors that her people's scientists had never recorded before. "I want to continue working with the humans," she announced. "I want to learn their methods, their way of thinking. I believe it will benefit my people." She was not alone. Requests had been flooding in from across the galaxy. Scientists from a dozen species wanted to study alongside humans. Engineers who had spent centuries in comfortable laboratories suddenly wanted to build things that might not work. Even the ancient architects who had not shared their knowledge with anyone in 10,000 years, had sent a formal request to establish an exchange program. Ambassador Iran looked at his fellow counselors. They had spent so long accepting the limits of the universe. They had lived so many years learning what could not be done. And now, watching these fragile creatures with their brief lives and their impossible dreams, something was changing in them. "The Exodus Protocol," he said slowly, "we no longer need it." "No," Counselor Prime agreed, "not for fleeing anyway. But perhaps for something else." The speaker's voice held something it had never held before: excitement. "The we designed could reach the void between galaxies. With modification, they could reach other galaxies entirely, not as refugees but as explorers." "If humans can break reality to save their galaxy," Oran said, "what might they accomplish with help? What might we all accomplish together?" The council looked at each other. For the first time in 10,000 years, they did not see limits. They saw possibilities. Maria watched them, and she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. This was what humans did best. Not just solving problems, but inspiring others to believe problems could be solved. Not just refusing to give up, but showing others that giving up was a choice, not a requirement. Months later, a research team found something in the debris of Operation Boomerang. A small personal item, recovered from the wreckage of the Perseverance, the first ship to dive into a black hole. It was a note, handwritten on actual paper, sealed in a protective case that had somehow survived everything. The note read, "They said it couldn't be done. They were technically correct. We did it anyway. That's the human way." It was signed by Captain John, who had given his life to move a singularity 200 kilometers. The note was preserved and displayed in the rebuilt Galactic Council chamber, mounted beneath a plaque that read, "In memory of those who refused to accept impossible." And in the years that followed, when other threats arose, when other crises threatened the galaxy, the Council's first question was no longer, "Can this be done?" Instead, they asked, "What would the humans try?" And then they tried it anyway. The universe, after all, was full of impossible things. But impossibility, it turned out, was just a challenge. A challenge that humans, and now their allies, were always ready to accept. The end.